All right, Photo 3-4, it is time to learn about manual exposure. Trust me, it's not as overwhelming or daunting as it seems. It's actually pretty simple. You know enough that you should be able to put it all together real quickly. Let's get started. Okay, you guys, step number one for shooting in manual is, of course, to make sure your mode dial is on the letter M. Duh, that's an easy no-brainer. And the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set our ISO. So I am taking these photographs in the shade, and a good starting ISO for shooting in the shade is 400. So the first thing I'm going to do is just set my ISO to what a good starting ISO would be. So here I go, I'll press the Q button, go to ISO, and I'm going to turn that down to 400. Step number one, completed. Step number two, we got to decide what kind of photo are we trying to take. There's two things you need to ask yourself. Do I care about depth of field, and do I care about my shutter speed? So am I trying to go for a shallow or deep depth of field, or am I trying to go for a fast or slow shutter speed? If it's none of those things, if you're like, I'm just trying to take photos, Johnson, I don't really care about either of those things right now, then that's also something we need to know. So once you have that figured out, it's pretty easy to do step number two. Let's assume for this example that we want to do a shallow depth of field photo. Well, that means that we care about the aperture, the f-stop. We care about that way more than we care about the shutter speed, although the shutter speed is still important. If we want a shallow depth of field, we know that we have to come in here and we have to set that f-stop down pretty low. I'm going to go ahead and drop that all the way down to f1.8 because that is as low as this lens goes. So I've set my ISO and I've set my step two, which was in this case was to set the aperture to something that would give me a shallow depth of field. And now I'm going to take a photo. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a photo now at whatever settings it was on, and let's see how that looks. Okay, you can see that is way overexposed. It's too bright. So I got a couple of options here. I can change my ISO, or I could just change my shutter speed. Let's do that. In this case, you can see I'm at 1/320. We know that a faster shutter speed will make my photo darker. So at this point, I'm just going to raise up my shutter speed and try again. And that's closer. That's still a touch on the bright side. So I'm going to just raise up my shutter speed a little bit more. And I'm really happy with that. I think that looks just about right. So that's it. We just went through the steps to setting manual exposure. 1, we set our ISO. 2, in this case, we wanted a shallow depth of field, so we set our aperture. And then step 3 is adjust the shutter speed until your exposure looks correct. Let's look at another example. Okay, so here's my next example. I haven't changed anything yet. I'm going to try and take a photo of this flower right here, but I want a real deep depth of field. I want everything in focus. So this time, let's start with step 1. Let's set the ISO first. I'm photographing in the sun now, so a good rule of thumb for starting in the sun is to set your ISO to 100. So let's do that. And because I want a deep depth of field, I'm going to change my f-stop or my aperture to f22. I'm going to put it as high as it goes. And let's just go ahead and move on to step 3, which is take a photo and see how it looks. And you can see that's really dark, way too dark, right? So what do I need to do? If a photo's too dark, you want to use a slower shutter speed. So I'm going to take my shutter speed 1/2000, and I'm going to slow that way down. Let's try, I don't know, 1/100. And that's still too dark, so I need to go even slower. Maybe like 1/40. Still a little dark, so I'm running into a real issue here now, you guys. And that in order to get this right, I'm probably going to have to shoot at about 1/15. The problem is it's a little bit windy out here. You can see that flower's moving around because of the wind. If I shoot at 1/15, it's going to be blurry. So how do I solve this problem? 1/15 at f22 at ISO 100 is the correct exposure, but my photo's not going to turn out if I shoot it at these settings. So what am I going to do? Well, if you suggested I raise the ISO, then you were correct. Remember, we always want the lowest ISO possible that gives us the shot that we want. So 100 is a good ISO, but it doesn't give us the shot we want. So what if I raise the ISO up to, let's go to 400. And then I can change my shutter speed now to 1/30, and 1/60-ish should give me a pretty good shot. Let's take a look and see how that looks. Yep, I'm real happy with that exposure. 1/60 is a fast enough shutter speed that it's not, the flower's not moving because of the wind. My ISO is as low as I can get it and still get the exposure I need. And I was able to shoot at f/22 to get that shallow, or excuse me, that deep depth of field. Okay, let's try another shot here. So I am out in front of my house here. I got my daughter here. In this case, I want a fast shutter speed photograph. So I'm going to, again, start at step 1, which is set my ISO. It is a super bright day out. I could probably pretty easily get away with shooting at ISO 100. Let's try it. Step number 2 is to set my shutter speed in this case, because I want to freeze motion in this photograph. I'm going to have her jumping, so freezing motion is my goal. So I'm going to set my shutter speed to about 1/1000, and I'm going to just take a photo and see how it turns out. You ready, Soph? Let's see a big jump. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, you can see, once again, way too dark. Well, I got 2 options here. I could raise my ISO, or I could just lower my f-stop, which is a much more reasonable option, and that's what I'm going to do. Let's drop this thing down to about f8 and try that. Ready, Soph? 1, 2, 3. And that's looking a little better. Still a little dark, though, so what are we going to do? Well, we could raise the ISO again, but we also still have some room in the aperture, so let's keep lowering that down until we get an exposure that we like. Let's try f4 and see how that looks. Ready, Soph? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's almost a little too bright, isn't it? So, not a problem, easy fix. Let's just raise up the aperture again to maybe about f5 or f5.6. Should be the last one. Ready? 1, 2, 3. And there you go. That's a great exposure that I was able to get manually to get the exposure that I wanted. Let's see if I can get this to refocus. And I think the photo turned out great. All right, so that's basically it for manual exposure, guys. Set your ISO first. Determine if you want a fast or slow shutter speed or a shallow or deep depth of field. Set your shutter speed or your f-stop accordingly. Take a photo. See how it looks. If it's too bright, use a faster shutter speed or a higher f-stop like f/22. If it's too dark, use a slower shutter speed or a lower f-stop like f4 or f2.8 or something like that. Or raise your ISO to make it brighter, or lower your ISO to make it darker. Well, what if you just want to shoot just to shoot? You're like, I'm not worried about shutter speed too much, and I'm not worried about aperture too much. In that case, set your ISO accordingly, and then set your f-stop to about f4, and then worry about your shutter speed, or set your shutter speed to about 1/125, 1/200, and then worry about your f-stop. Those are both good, safe, middle-of-the-road f-stops or shutter speeds that will work in a lot of scenarios. And there you go. That's it. Manual exposure explained pretty simply.